It's tools, models, the infrastructure, the understanding of the underlying disease biology, what to look for, how to measure it. That's all starting to really happen.
But if there's some better way to bring cohesion and bring scale of dollars so that the researchers can just apply to one or two rather than a whole bunch of different grants, I think that would be interesting. So,
like I said, I was just at this meeting this week. The science was amazing. There were all of these new people coming to the field who weren't there 2 years ago or 5 years ago and bringing their brilliance and their new techniques and their new perspectives. It's getting faster and faster and more creative and more people and more, and more resources. We're taking a lot of new and different approaches, which are really exciting.
First of all, this is my voice. I'm Tim Green and I have ALS. This podcast is not about ALS or living with disabilities. I don't want you to feel sorry for me. I don't feel sorry for me. I am a father of 5 with a marriage that's lasted for over 33 years. I am a #1 New York Times best-selling author of 41 books, an NFL first-round pick with an 8-year career. I worked on TV for Fox Sports, Good Morning America, Court TV, and Extra. I've hosted BattleBots, A Current Affair, and Find My Family. And I am also a practicing attorney. In this podcast, we're diving into real-life stories. From triumphs to trials, we'll explore the extraordinary in the ordinary. Join me, Tim Green, and my son Troy each week for real conversations, laughter, and insights. Because life is a journey, and everyone's got a story. My voice in today's episode is powered by 11 Labs. Today, we're talking about something personal, something urgent. ALS is one of the toughest prognoses out there, but the people we have on today are doing something about it. Craig Boyce and Dr. Melanie Leitner of the ALS Investment Fund. The fund is backing the companies trying to find real solutions. Craig comes from the world of private equity and global finance, while Melanie is a neuroscientist who has spent years in the trenches of ALS research. Together, they're using both business and science to change the future of this disease. We're going to get into what's working, what's not, and what's next. But before we get into that, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Tim and Troy. It's a real honor. I feel like we've been engaging with Troy a few times along the last few months, and Tim is the first chance to meet you. But it's a real honor. I feel like I've known you, even though I haven't yet met you from all the podcasts, your books. My son and I enjoyed reading so many of them. And all that you're doing for ALS. We've been real admirer. We're obviously close friends with Merit and big supporters, and know you are as well. So thank you for having us on. We're really excited to have the conversation.
Craig, you spent nearly 2 decades at Bain Capital working on billion-dollar deals. What made you step away from that world and focus on ALS?
Yeah, Tim, appreciate the question. It's ALS has been a 30-year journey for me. It started before my time at Bain Capital. Troy, I think I was probably about the same age as you when your father was diagnosed. My father was diagnosed. I was about 22. I had just graduated from Princeton, and 2 days after that, I found out that my father had been diagnosed. So if you can imagine, going from this high of graduating college and then this immense low, I knew something was up, was wrong. My father, he was slurring his speech throughout my senior year, but I had this thought, and my parents told me that, that he was going to get better. They didn't know exactly what was wrong. But they didn't want it to impact my senior year and my college or my professional choice. So I was a chemical engineer, initially, didn't know anything about private equity or consulting. And when I found out about the diagnosis, I wanted to pursue a research project in ALS, and so that's what I thought I would do. Was planning to go up to MIT. Before I did that, the summer I spent at Merck and worked on their Crixivan drug, scaling up their Crixivan drug, early AIDS drug, and then would spend the evenings in the library trying to learn about ALS. I then went up to MIT and was looking for a project, but unfortunately couldn't find one. That was 30 years ago, and so 30 years ago, there wasn't that much going on in ALS. Then thankfully, the world has changed dramatically, and particularly over the last 4 or 5 years since we've started the investment fund. So I, not being able to find a project and having 3 younger siblings, a father who was continuing to progress with the disease, he had the bulbar onset, so it was progressing quite quickly. I pivoted and went into business. I spent a couple of years at Bain & Company, strategy consulting, and then 18 years at Bain Capital, private equity investing. And it was after I returned from a stint overseas in Hong Kong that I got introduced through a mutual friend to Felix von Kopper, who founded the ALS Investment Fund in Europe in 2016. We collaborated over that year while I was still at Bain Capital, and I put a little bit of money in the fund. And then in 2017, when I finished at Bain Capital, I joined with Felix and with Melanie. And Felix smartly found Melanie as our chief science officer, real thought leader in ALS. And that's been the last 7-8 years of my life has been focused my second career on combining this career experience in private equity investing with my mission in ALS, and it's been incredibly rewarding, and the opportunity to interact with folks like yourself, Tim, and has been truly inspiring and life changing in many ways.
And Melanie, you've built your career around neuroscience and disease research. What drew you specifically to ALS?
Yeah, so I'd actually decided I wanted to be a neuroscientist. This is gonna make you think I'm a serious geek when I was in 7th grade. So I did a report on the brain when I was 12, and I decided this is the coolest thing ever, and I want to study this for forever and try and understand it more. So my PhD work was actually in Parkinson's, focusing more on Parkinson's. And I actually came into ALS when I started working for an organization called Prize for Life, which was a new nonprofit that had been started by a bunch of students out of Harvard Business School when one of their classmates was diagnosed at the age of 27. So these students had this very bold idea. This was back in the time of the X Prize. So the X Prize was this large $10 million prize that basically catalyzed commercial space flight. And I think they were particularly struck by the fact that, X Prize put out a $10 million prize, and then the teams competing for that prize brought $400 million to bear into their competition. So they thought, wow, this would be a great thing to do in ALS if we could attract eyeballs, attract dollars, attract, interest into this space by putting out a large prize, then we could really help accelerate the space. And so they were looking for somebody who was willing to take a little bit of a chance on an idea like this, because at the time, this was back in 2006, the prize model had never actually been used in biomedicine. It had only been used for engineering challenges. So I was looking for a way to combine my interest at that time in the nonprofit space and neuroscience together. And so when I saw the position, I thought, this sounds amazing, a little scary because, nobody had ever done this. The organization didn't really exist yet, it had to be built. But I met the founders, the CEO, Avikai Kremer, and he was really inspiring. And I said, okay, I'm going to learn everything I can about ALS and help you build this organization. And so that's what we did. And we launched a couple of $1 million prizes, not a 10 million, but $1 million prize, a couple of them in ALS, and spent a lot of time trying to bring more drug companies into the space and really just, disrupt. That was the Harvard Business School kind of, jargon that they were using to try and disrupt this space, including building large infrastructure initiatives like the PROACT database, clinical trials database, and just really making it easier for more people to bring their smarts and their resources into ALS.
When they asked you about that in 2006, ALS was so different than it is today. Did you think it could be, what it is now, or what did you think at the time?
At the time, honestly, at the time when I started digging into this, I said, this is the hardest disease. This is the hardest problem I've ever seen. because there was so much that was unknown at the time. The disease was so heterogeneous in the way that it presented from one person to another person. And I remember reading this really long report as I was trying to immerse myself in the space and just being like, wow, this is going to be a real fight. This is really, really complicated. But it was also really exciting because it felt like, we could make a difference. And I wanted to make that difference also. Avi, I could see him getting the disease progressing. And so it was really personal also to try and to fix, to stop, to make things better.
You both come from very different worlds, one from finance, one from science. How did you come together to lead the ALS Investment Fund?
You want me to start, Craig?
Sure.
So it's actually kind of funny. So I was working as a consultant, and I got this cold email out of the blue from some folks in Europe. And they said, we have a whole bunch of questions about ALS. Would you, answer some of these questions? And I didn't know who these people were, but they seemed like they really wanted to do something. And so I said, okay. And so I went and answered all of their questions. They were surveying a bunch of people. And then they said, can we come back to you with some follow-up questions? And I said, okay. And so they came back to me with a whole bunch of follow-up questions. And then we started talking. And it turned out this was our third partner, Felix, and his colleagues over in Amsterdam. And they were in the process of building what is now the ALS Investment Fund. And so as we got to talking, Felix said, would you like to come and help us more? And I said, this is really exciting. I'd be happy to, if I can be helpful, I'm happy to try. So that was sort of how I got connected to them. But really it was because they had sent out this survey questionnaire of a lot of questions about ALS and drug companies in ALS and targets in ALS and all different aspects. And I guess I took the time to answer them.
So cold emails still work. That's the takeaway.
Well, at least back then.
less and less these days, I think. But yeah, clearly it was Felix was the founding partner and the one that brought us all together. Although I would say both Melanie and I are in the Boston area, and I had been in parallel with my business career. I'd been heavily involved philanthropically with a number of different ALS nonprofits, raising money for research and patient services, oftentimes linked with Dr. Brown, but even well beyond that. And I remember when all these different, when there was only the ALS Association, more or less, and how all these groups have kind of grown since then. For me, I got introduced to Felix through a mutual friend. I just returned from Hong Kong and had a mutual friend who was heading off on an expat stint in the Netherlands. And he and I had raised a bunch of money for Dr. Brown's research, and he had a couple of friends that were impacted by ALS, and so he was in the community. And when he went to Amsterdam, as luck would have it, he was living around the corner from Felix, and the ALS community being small, and Amsterdam in particular, got connected to Felix and made the introduction. And as I said before, I then started collaborating informally with Felix and Melanie, and then joined in 2017. And it's really a unique and complementary partnership. We each bring a real talent. I think we each have a real respect and appreciation for the talents of the other person, how complementary they are. Felix is the entrepreneur or the operator by background, Melanie, the science expert. And I had a deep personal connection to ALS as well as the investing background. And together in combination, that really is the key elements of the ALS Investment Fund. And so it really works quite well in terms of a partnership.
Maybe just to add, Felix on his end, how he came into this. So he was, as Craig said, an entrepreneur by background. And he was working for a large, he was entrepreneur in residence at a large VC firm in the Netherlands. And 3 ALS patients came and said, we have this idea that we think that if there were a VC fund that targeted ALS, we could make a big difference. And so the large investment fund tapped Felix and said, is this a challenge you wanted to take on? And so I didn't realize it, but that was the questions that he was sending. That was part of the sort of their diligence around, is this a concept that could actually, could this become real? And could we really launch a venture capital fund with a focus on ALS?
That's cool.
Yeah. So this is serendipity. Also, Craig, I remember us talking, and you came to Needham, I think, and we went to a Thai restaurant. I was having lunch with you, I think, in a Thai restaurant nearby, and I knew you had connected to Bob, who actually lives around the corner from me, and some other people, and so we were just talking about like ALS and what does ALS need, and so I was so excited when we all joined together. It was really.
Yeah, it was amazing because I know I've been at some of the Avi Kramer events that you were there, and we just hadn't really put it all together. But I'm sure we were in the same room numerous times, and our ALS network overlaps heavily. I mean, I've known Dr. Brown for 30 years, and he was the doctor that I went to with my father. And I had an intention when I came up to Boston to try to find a project with him, but just across Harvard and MIT, and being a chemical engineer wasn't quite a neuroscientist or an MD, and so it didn't work out scientifically. But hopefully, we can apply the investing skills to accelerate ALS therapeutic development.
Yeah. And Avi, he was also Avi's doctor, my CEO. So in a way, I guess Bob Brown also helped bring us all. His catalytic in the fund. I mean, he's
of course Merritt is worked under Bob as well. So Bob's the ultimate ALS godfather, if you will.
Yeah. ALS is brutal. No cure, limited treatment options, and historically, drug development has been painfully slow. Why has it been so hard to crack?
Yep, that's the exact same question that the Prize for Life founders were asking back when I joined in 2007. I think it's a combination of things, and Craig and I, we talked about, and Felix, we talked about this as well. I think it's a combination of that we've been missing over time some key tools that you need for drug development. So we didn't have good biomarkers. We're getting better, and maybe we'll talk about that later, but that's something where I certainly see a lot of hope and momentum now, but we haven't historically had really good biomarkers. And we know from MS and what happened in multiple sclerosis that when they actually got a good way to measure the disease and changing the disease in the person, that was really catalytic for drug development in that space. So there used to be, no really effective drugs in multiple sclerosis, and now there's, a dozen. So ALS was missing that. And then also, like I was saying before, the complexity of the heterogeneity. So no two people, as you know, probably better than I do with ALS, it's different in everyone. It's different where it starts. It's different how it spreads. It's different at the rate. It's different, and so trying to get a handle on what are the molecular bases for that has just been really hard. And then it's in the brain. So the brain is also really hard to target drugs because it's a privileged site. Things don't get into the brain, which is good. We don't want, viruses or bacteria or whatever, or poisons or stuff to go into our brain, but it makes it harder to study and harder to treat. So I think that's some of the reasons. And then I think also maybe there's been a, neuroscience in general, drug companies kind of come in and then they go out and then they come in and they go out. There's sort of this cyclical nature to how brave, in a way, I want to say, or how compelled companies feel or how likely they think they are to be successful. And so, there's enthusiasm, people will come in, and then, there'll be a large Alzheimer's trial that costs $2 billion that will fail and everybody will leave neuroscience again. And so we've just seen this over and over the past 30, 40 years.
Yeah, it seems hard science and funding, particularly historically. And I think that started to change 11 years ago with the Ice Bucket Challenge that brought in an infusion of a couple $100 million and awareness. And I think that's driven a lot of the innovation that we're seeing today. And then the last handful of years, the science has really progressed, as Melanie alluded to, biomarkers, improve target identification. And we're really excited about the pipeline of opportunities. Given the 10 million that Tackle has raised and the money that Target ALS has raised and all these different groups, it's really driving innovation coming out of the lab and into the clinic. And that's really where we look to pick up the torch and carry it through that phase 1, phase 2 proof of concept, where pharma then gets really, really excited about it.
When we had Merritt and Brooke on, they talked about the kind of pharma companies not funding ALS as much, and it was slowing down because whatever reason, the investing atmosphere, or whether it's because of, some people kind of blame the stuff that happened with Amylyx and that. But, what do you think? How do you think you turn that around?
Yeah, I was listening in on that. We can do some things on like a micro level. On a macro level, that's sort of, that's just investment in biotech has also been somewhat cyclical. There was a big bubble with COVID and a lot of companies came in and things didn't work. And so now either money's tied up or people are more hesitant. But I think some of the things that we can do, so one of the questions I think Brooke and might have asked specifically was, how do we get VCs to be interested in ALS? And, we talk to them, right? So we're a VC, we're the ALS Investment Fund, we're thoroughly in ALS. And we also talk to other VCs. And I think so we can help make a case as to why a company pursuing an ALS therapy has a high likelihood of success. So that's one thing I think that we certainly can do. And then also just you even see it between Craig and myself, just trying to bridge between the science and the business case. There's a really strong business case to come into ALS. I mean, people don't necessarily appreciate it, but that's something that we can, and we have told pharma. I mean, so for a long time, pharma didn't think that ALS, was a big enough indication. Amylyx showed that it was. So when Amylyx came in, a lot of companies were like, we should go into ALS now. So I think that is still true. And so it's just reminding people of, why this is a space worth considering and worth investing in and putting time and people and resources into.
Yeah, we see, increasing interest in pharma. When we started the fund, pharma was getting out of neuro, right? So Pfizer was sold off their whole neuro division. And now you hear quotes from the CEO of Eli Lilly, David Ricks, that next decade it's going to be the decade of neurodegeneration. And that's really exciting. That's the view that we have as well. And pharma, they couldn't grab an ALS therapeutic, a promising ALS therapeutic fast enough, but they're hesitant to take the risk in the phase 1, phase 2 before you have proof of concept. But you show proof of concept, they're going to love the opportunity for any neurodegenerative, but ALS, in particular as well. And so I think the big hurdle and the void that we're trying to fill is take that pipeline of great science that's coming out of innovation of targets and get it into the clinical trial. We see, a dozen or more companies in the pipeline that are really on the cusp of getting into the clinic with exciting, innovative science that hopefully could be used in combination, like a cocktail, to address the multitude of biology that's going wrong in the body and really slow the progression of ALS and turn it from a terminal illness to one that can be chronically managed. And that's the goal. And so the role that we're trying to fill and to play is to invest in companies as they're IND ready or getting close to the clinic, support them through the clinical trials, which philanthropy has been amazing. And we always say to everybody that keep giving, give and then give again, donation dollars. We don't want to take a single dime of that money into the fund. What we're looking to do is get an allocation of people's investment portfolio and bring more money into ALS and to use the capital markets to fill the void to fund clinical trials, which are tens of millions of dollars. And so way beyond the scope of where philanthropy can fill the need. And so this is a new model, a model that the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation 25 years ago brought into common practice, really innovated. And it's something that we try to try to carry forward.
And the stuff that you see, I don't know what you're allowed to say and not say. The stuff you see on the horizon in the pipeline, are you seeing stuff that's more about slowing versus, or more, I guess, repairing and regeneration?
Yeah. So I think, and Merritt talked a little bit about this. I still think we're seeing more focused on slowing right now. And part of that is because that's probably an easier bar to cross. Part of it is also because the regulatory pathway has that's a little bit more clear. Like the regulators, both here and in Europe, have said, if you can slow progression measured using this scale that everybody uses, then and you can do that and show that you can do that with your drug and it's statistically significant, then we'll consider that for approval. So I think slowing is something that's seen as maybe a little bit more near term. Although we do have, and I think, Merritt talked about this as well, we do have a drug that was recently approved on the market, which does seem to, at least in some people, help them regain function that they've lost, which is extraordinary. And I have to say, I thought we were still 10 years away from that. So the fact that we're seeing it now is really, really encouraging.
Which one was that? Which medicine was that?
Yeah, that's Qalsody. That's Biogen's SOD1 targeted therapy, also called tofersen, which was approved for specifically that narrow slice of ALS that have that mutation. So, and if we can slow the disease, that also buys more time for us to try and come up with ways to repair. But I think just in terms of the larger pipeline, most of the companies are focused on taking a smaller step before a really large step. I wanted to answer Brooke's question when when I was listening. I know it was back in October, but I was like, Brooke, that's a great question. You should talk to VCs, and we're talking to VCs, and we should talk to the same VCs. That would be a way to leverage our efforts. But we do see there are a number of VCs, the ones who are really neuroscience focused, who are very interested. We get a lot of questions. I get a lot of VCs, coming and saying, what do you think of this? Is this an approach? Is this going to work? So I think there's definitely interest. Oh, and then the other thing, Craig made this point before, but we have pharmas who are investors who are around the table with us for several of the companies we've invested in. So pharma is right there. They're at the table. They're giving advice to the companies, saying, so we see that with big pharmas.
We've seen diseases like cancer and Alzheimer's receive massive funding, yet ALS has lagged behind. Is it just a numbers game, or is there something else at play?
I think it's just mostly a numbers game. I mean, there's, even though the incidence of ALS, people are surprised when you tell them 1 in 400 people will get ALS. But that's still a lot less than Alzheimer's or cancer. So I think it's just that those are much larger populations. And so that's why both on the government side, I think, and on the pharma side, more resources have gone into both traditionally. So I don't think there's anything. Yeah, I don't think there's anything. I actually think that recently, and Craig mentioned the Ice Bucket Challenge, but also recently with Act for ALS, $500 million for ALS. That was an extraordinary, I want to say, win for the community. So I think that there's definitely an appreciation that ALS deserves resources. And just in the time, that I've been working in the field, I've seen the resources. So DOD doubled the resources they were putting in. NIH doubled the resources they were putting in. So I think there's been both in response to the advocacy community, which has been incredibly effective, and also with the appreciation that we're getting closer to actually having therapies, having a way to benefit, ALS patients, people with lived experience. I think that's also been leading to those increases.
Yeah, I think the exciting thing is, historically that definitely has been true. I mean, for most of the 30 years that I've been in it, it's been underfunded, and amazingly, people, scientists, pharma weren't thinking about the incidence versus prevalence difference, where incidence is similar to MS, but prevalence is a lot less because of the life expectancy. But I think that's changing. And we see that with big pharma focusing a lot more on neuro and declaring the next decade being the decade of neurodegeneration, and so in addition to efforts that we see Target ALS has just raised $270 million, and so money is kind of coming in, and we're hopeful that we can be a part of that with the fund.
Do you worry from just a pure investment standpoint? I know both of you would like to see anything good that could happen for ALS happen, but do you, again, purely investment, do you worry about technology kind of winning the race? And if something like a Neuralink would work and regain function, that maybe from the investment side it would just dry up?
We strive to put ourselves out of business. That's our goal, which would be great. I think we would look at some of those opportunities. Neuralink, maybe not so much. It's exactly, but I do think there's likely an underlying biology that's going to need to be fixed with a treatment beyond like a Neuralink. So I'm not too worried about technology fix in and of itself. I think we continue to believe it's going to be a multitude of therapeutics, a cocktail, and that our goal is to invest across a range of different therapeutic targets. TDP-43 is obviously a huge one, the gold standard right now, but there's a whole bunch of other dynamics that are at play: axonal degeneration, neuroinflammation, mitochondria support, and others. And so we're trying to identify the most promising therapeutic targets, and then and that's driven by Melanie's thought leadership, and then at the same time tracking a database of over 200 companies, private companies, that have an ALS therapeutic in their pipeline. And so our goal is to match the most promising targets with the most promising companies going after those targets, and that's how we would prioritize our pipeline and our investments. We obviously can't invest in everything. We'd love to. We'd love to invest and support every company. We try to, at the very least, provide thoughts and advice along the way, even if we can't invest, to support their development. But there's beyond the science, there's a number of things that we also consider before making an investment. And so just because we don't make an investment doesn't mean it's not going to be successful. But there is an element of timing and stage of the company that we need to consider as well.
Yeah, the progress they've made in those brain chip that's been insane to see.
Yeah.
It's amazing. But I still think, I guess that, and I also love, Team Gleason and the concept that until we have a cure and a treatment, technology is going to be the best, way to help people live rich, fulfilled lives. I really believe that. I've spent a fair bit of time thinking about assistive technologies and, how do we optimize those? What do people really want? What do they need? Where are the markets not working? But I think at the end of the day, you could imagine maybe we're all going to be in an exoskeleton and we're all going to be, driven by our mind, this kind of thing, like our Iron Man suits. But I think that therapies are going to be really a critical part of the equation for the next couple of decades. And I guess if ACI was, solved everything, I'd be really happy with that too. I think it's a really hard, although there's amazing innovations, I've seen, people developing chips that are flexible so that they actually, you're not trying to put a hard metal based chip on top of the brain, but you actually have something that's either itself organic, or is it self-flexible so it can conform to the brain? And people are endlessly innovative and brilliant in their technological innovations, but it's really hard to think about wiring up, all of the body. Yeah.
For a long time, there was very little progress in ALS treatments, but now we're seeing some movement. What's changed? Are we at a turning point?
I hope so. So I think, and I think Merritt had some thoughts on this as well. Several things have changed. So a key thing has been that the regulatory path has been established. So, in order to get a therapy all the way to people, to the market, there's a lot of steps it has to go through, and those were really not clear for a long time. So having that path be well established, and that's been sort of in between the advocacy community working together with the regulators, with FDA and with EMA. I think so that's changed. I think there's a lot more, as Craig just mentioned, a lot more resources coming into the space. So we're taking a lot of new and different approaches, which are really exciting. I think this point that we made before about appreciating that ALS is not actually that rare a disease, even though it's an orphan disease. That's because of the fact that it's a really aggressive illness, not because people don't get the illness. So that awareness, I think, has changed dramatically. So, and then there's just also more science that people can bring to bear in terms of data sets, in terms of samples, in terms of models, animal models, cellular models. So there's just a lot more tools and infrastructure. And so science itself is in some ways getting faster. And I think that's also benefiting ALS.
And the one you mentioned before, Melanie, biomarkers, I mean, that seems to be the key. I know that neurofilament light is now something that you can get approval on, and you don't even need to necessarily meet your secondary your endpoints in your phase 2 trial, which was what happened with Biogen. But that neurofilament light acts more quickly than the clinical benefits, and so that's really exciting. And what that allows us hopefully to not throw away drugs that are working, that we just didn't run a long enough trial, and move on more quickly from drugs that aren't likely to work. And so it just again, I think having those biomarkers, additional tools, and scientific targets that we're going after, just should increase the flywheel and should give us more opportunities, more shots on goal. And I think with that, I think we're all quite optimistic of the next decade, and certainly maybe even less than that.
Yeah, I think the clinical trial innovations as well. I mean, Merritt talked about the Healy platform. There's now a platform in the UK. There's going to be a platform in Europe, or there is a platform in Europe. So making it easier and faster and more effective and efficient to run ALS clinical trials is also a huge accelerant. The Healy platform has run more drugs over the past 3-4 years than we could have ever done before that in that short a period of time because of these efficiencies. So I think that's also a key part of, as we're hopefully getting closer to an inflection point where we're going to start seeing more effective drugs coming more quickly. I think all of that feeds together. It's tools, models, the infrastructure, the understanding of the underlying disease biology, what to look for, how to measure it. That's all starting to really happen.
Be straight with us. What are the biggest roadblocks right now? What's stopping us from having a real breakthrough?
I think about this a lot. I think there's a couple key things. One of them, and you'll hear different things from different people in the field, so this is just my particular bias or perspective. I think one thing that's really challenging is we don't have models that we know translate into people. So we don't have a way to screen drugs, test drugs, look at dosing for drugs before which we know are going to predict what happens in people. So for some diseases where, you can take a cancer and you can put it in a mouse and it's the same cancer that's going to be in the person as it's going to be in the mouse. And you can, do all kinds of things like that. So we don't have great models, I think, is one key roadblock. And this was something that we thought about tackling back at Prize for Life. And it's really hard because there's not a great, the animals are just different in some key ways from people, the animals that people use in the lab. And so that's been a major challenge. And then going back to the question of biomarkers, NFL is a really interesting biomarker, an important one in terms of being able to gauge sort of at a higher level whether or not a bunch of the drivers of the disease, you're really influencing them, but it's not specific at all to any given mechanism. It's a relatively non-specific marker. And so we need more specific markers so we can, again, measure those in people and see if the drug or the treatment approach that's being pursued is actually helping that given person. And then the last thing I think, and I think we're making really good progress on it, but it's just so hard, is that, in cancer 30 years ago, like everybody who had, lung cancer, we all lumped them together. We said, you have lung cancer because that's where we see your cancer. And we now know that one person's lung cancer is not another person's lung cancer, and in fact might be more similar to a colon cancer. And the site of the disease, where it started, doesn't tell you anything about what's actually driving it. And so we were lumping together people whose disease was very different. And I think we do that in ALS. We lump together people because they look, to our eye, to our clinical observation, they look the same, but the drivers of the disease are different. And so when we put those people both into a clinical trial with the same drug, they're going to respond really differently. And so that makes it very hard to run clinical trials because we can't separate out people who are more likely to respond to a given therapeutic intervention. So that's where this whole idea of precision medicine or stratification is being pursued very heavily. Answer ALS has devoted millions of dollars to going after this, but we're still not there. And so once we can do that, once we can actually say, okay, this group of people, they have an energy defect. That's what's driving their disease. And this group of people, they have, an axonal degeneration. That's what's driving their disease. And this people have an inflammatory driver for their disease. Once we can separate that out, then I think that allows us to be more effective in our drug development.
How could they find the answer to that? Is it just taking all the data from all the patients and comparing it? It sounds like, I know AI is such a buzzword right now, but this sounds like something that AI would be able to do if you had all the information.
I think that's exactly what a lot of people are hoping, is that if we can get the right data and look at it in the right way in a large, machine learning approach, AI approach, informatics approach, then we will be able to start teasing that out. And I think that that's probably true, but what piece of, what do we actually need to be generating that data from? Is that taking, brain tissue from people who've passed away? Like we don't know what the source of that data needs to be. Is it blood samples? Maybe it's not in the blood. Maybe it has to be in spinal fluid. Maybe it's not in spinal fluid. Maybe it's in tissue. Maybe. So part of that is if we had the right source for the right type of data, and we knew which was the right type of data, right? Is it protein data? Is it metabolites? Is it fats? Is it lipids? Is it, we don't actually know exactly which is the right type of data. But so we're doing all of the above because we don't know what the right source is and what the right type of data is that's going to distinguish between people. But we are letting AI loose on, or letting, I should say, our bioinformaticists, letting them loose on and making bigger and bigger data sets. So I think we're getting closer as well there. Someday we will be able to separate apples and oranges.
Let's talk about the ALS Investment Fund. What exactly does it do, and how is it different from traditional venture capital?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think as Melanie described earlier, the vision of the fund was to really bring capital and talent together, with the view that if you do that, you can solve seemingly impossible challenges. And so, with that, the fund was born. Felix was tapped to lead it. He brought in Melanie, and then I joined in 2017. It initially was a deal by deal vehicle, and so what that means, traditionally venture capital raises a committed pool of funding, and then makes investments across a portfolio of maybe 10 to 20 companies. In the deal by deal, it's a little bit in reverse. You find the investment opportunity first, and then you go raise the capital, and each one is a different special purpose vehicle, SPV. And so we did that 9 times over the last 7 years, and invested about $70 million across those 9 investments. And then now we're in the process of converting that into a committed pool of capital, more VC style. And so we would look very much similar to a traditional venture capital fund. The main difference is our focus. And it's, I think some investors might think it's a little bit narrow. We're the ALS Investment Fund, so we lead every investment would have an ALS relevance to it. But we really touch on broader neurodegenerative funds. So if you were to look at our portfolio, at least one of our companies would have a Parkinson's, an Alzheimer's, a Huntington's, an epilepsy therapeutic in their pipeline. And so there's more diversity than the name would suggest, but we really lead with ALS. And the belief is that ALS could be the key that unlocks the door to broader neuro. And the reason that is, unfortunately for patients, it tends to progress quite quickly. But for scientists, the speed of progression allows them to run smaller, shorter trials in order to pick up on the effectiveness of drugs. And so what that means when you're running smaller, shorter trials, they're cheaper. And so you can test and learn quicker, cheaper. But the application is likely relevant to broader neuro, just given the overlapping biologies across Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. There's likely to be innovations that within ALS that could be relevant to other diseases. And we see that in our companies. They're oftentimes platforms that could be leveraged across the different neurodegenerative indications. And so that's the main difference between a traditional venture capitalist and our fund. It's getting more narrow, but our specialty really is what we think sets us apart and differentiates us. We've done 9, soon to be 10 investments in the ALS space. I think that's a 2 or 3-fold at least more than the next most prevalent or active life science fund in the ALS space. And so we oftentimes have a network of other venture funds that we'll try to tap into. We like to invest alongside a consortium because there's more insight and knowledge, as well as more capital that's done collaboratively and collectively. And so that's our strategy there.
But maybe I'll just take advantage of that question just for a second to say that our challenge often is not being confused with other venture capital funds. It's people confuse us with other foundations or with philanthropies. And the ALS Investment Fund is not a philanthropy. So it's a true venture fund. I mean, it's, with people who are investing and are expecting return on their investments. And it's focused on a different, I think Craig said this earlier, a different part of, the pipeline of, so philanthropy and government really need to focus on early stages of discovery research. Because it's not something that the market is gonna pay for. But once you start getting closer to these large clinical trials, those are expensive, and that's more money than a philanthropy can, for the most part, fund. And that's where the markets really need to come into play. And so it's really hard and frustrating sometimes for us when people think that, why aren't you funding my lab or my grant or because we're not a philanthropy, we're an investment fund. And so it's I think it plays a really important role in the ecosystem, but it's a different role than philanthropy. And I think philanthropy has a really, really important role to play. But, as I hope we're demonstrating, venture also has an important role to play.
And sometimes these single disease funds, and historically, they have been set up inside foundations. So the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation is really the poster child. And in many ways, although we're for-profit and they were inside a not-for-profit, we model ourselves after their vision and their success. And so if you're not familiar with their story, they started in 2000. Joe O'Donnell had a child with cystic fibrosis and said we must, how do we catalyze activity? How do we really bring more funding to bear? And his idea was, instead of just giving away money in grants, was to actually take a royalty, invest in research, and take a royalty right back in that research. And so they did that over the course of 15 years or so. They invested over $400 million. And then their first drug came out of Vertex in 2012, a drug called Kalydeco. And then a couple of years later, they combined that with a couple of other drugs, and now they can treat well over 90% of the cases of cystic fibrosis. And that would be, in and of itself, would be an amazing, amazing story and success story over 15 years to drive to that. But then they went and sold their royalty rights to Royalty Pharma for over $3 billion, and they brought all that money back into the foundation. Now they continue to invest and reinvest in further research. And so it's that model that we'd love to see and we'd love to catalyze within ALS. The challenge in ALS is that no single foundation was that large. I mean, that was a $100 million plus annual budget organization. And most of the ALS organizations are relatively small and fragmented, so don't have the resources to build that. And that was why the ALS Investment Fund was set up in a for-profit model context, so that we could attract other monies, investor dollars, rather than just philanthropy dollars. We could still be the platform for other for ALS nonprofits who have an endowment or have capital that they're investing, rather than giving it to Morgan Stanley or Bank of America. They could invest in the fund, where they're investing in the mission with the opportunity to make a return that could then be reinvested within ALS. But it also allows us to go out and approach other investors, high net worth individuals, family offices, fund of funds, endowments, and others, to put money into ALS. They may like the mission. They may be attracted by the mission. But they may also just see it as an interesting slice of their investment portfolio, an opportunity to have an impact on a disease while making a return. And so it's allowed us to attract more capital than we think we would have been able to being housed inside a foundation.
I think it's also a nice, clear separation. So a foundation has, they're a nonprofit, they have a nonprofit mission. And so I think, just having it very clear from the beginning of for-profit versus nonprofit mission allows for just clarity also.
A lot of biotech startups fail before they ever get a drug to market. When you're looking at a company, what makes you confident enough to invest?
Yeah, you want me to start or you want to start? That's a hard question.
Yeah, I mean, it starts with the science, and so we lead with Melanie's thought leadership and assessment. That's the a gating item, and then we look to bring in the community. We've got a network of ALS experts, including Merit and many others, who will help us assess a company's probability of success. But ultimately, it's an educated assessment. It's not a for certain assessment. And like all venture investing, there's high risk and probably particularly in life science, an early stage drug development life science. But the opportunities for big rewards, so risk reward we think is interesting, because there's opportunities to make big returns if you're successful in creating a therapy that ultimately has benefit to patients. So it starts with the science. That's the first gate. But then it really is about the team, the scientists, the founders, and the team that's been built around that. So like any other investment, you want to make sure you've got a strong team that will often track them, work with them for a year plus before making investments, so we can see how they're delivering on what they're promising, and see how their science progresses. So it's not just a 1 week in time assessment. We're really seeing it over a period of time, and then. So I think those are the two main things. Having a great team and great science can help mitigate your risk of failing before you get into clinic. But at the end of the day, it is still a challenging area without a clear knowledge of what's going to ultimately be successful.
I mean, I think your strong company it seemed like the philosophy was really around people and finding people that you think you could work with, people you'd enjoy working with, and believe in what they're doing, and where you can have good communication, where you can be. And also, I think we try and add value to our companies. So we don't just put in money and then hope that they're successful. We work really closely with them to try and help them be successful. And then we also look for other, as I mentioned before, we talk to other VCs. So we're looking also for partners, like-minded VCs that are sort of in for the long haul. We don't just go in and try and flip things or, do quick in and out for the most part. We're really committed to the companies and to their success. And so we wish we could help more companies. And we do have to be choosy, but that's partially because we're small. And then I guess the other piece I should have said also is that when we look at the science, I mean, we're looking pretty hard to make sure that, the rationale is really strong, the preclinical data to support the target, all of the work that led up to the company when they come to us, that we really believe in it, that it was well controlled, that it was well designed, that, that they were doing their experiments the right way. So there's a lot of pressure testing, I think, that goes into it. But then at the end of the day, it's still somewhat of a leap of faith.
Your fund's biggest win so far has been Amylyx. What made you bet on them, and what can other companies learn from both their success and their struggles?
That's a really good question. So in terms of sort of the case for working with Amylyx, really early at the beginning, I think we were impressed with the fact that there were already clinical signs for both components of their compound. So it's a Relyvrio is a combination of two different therapeutic entities, and each of those had shown some therapeutic efficacy in small ALS trials. So that was compelling to us. I think the team and the commitment they had, so they actually, the founders of Amylyx, were very involved in, and grew out of, in many ways, with the support of the ALS community. So they did not sort of come in from outside and say, we think we have the answer and we're going to tell you guys what to do. And it was with the support and help and feedback continuously from the ALS community that they were advancing that drug forward. So I think that was also compelling. And then, mechanistically, they had the mechanistic rationale made sense as something that that could be valuable in ALS. So I think what we can learn from their success is that, and I think that, folks are learning this, that there is an ALS market, that it's possible to be successful with an ALS therapeutic drug. We've learned that the regulators are willing to exert regulatory flexibility, that they're really, trying to be very, very thoughtful and appreciate the voice of, of people with lived experience in ALS in terms of risk profiles, in terms of, desire and what's meaningful, what's clinically meaningful to the population. So there are a huge number of learnings. I think in terms of challenges, one of my personal takeaways, which I think other people also share, is that the fact that they did not really have a target engagement marker in the true sense, so that that they could know that their drug was working in the short term, like it was the whole development plan was purely based on clinical endpoints, which which are very valuable and important, but we also need some sort of near term readouts. And then also, I guess one of my other big takeaways is that we have to be very, very careful again of the heterogeneity of the ALS population. Because if you start off with imbalance at the beginning, if your groups are not matched up, and for along whatever axis that is, if your treated group and your placebo group are fundamentally different in some way, that that can happen in a small study, then that can play out all along the course of the study. And so that's something that I feel like I have really, and I tell companies to be really, really careful with over-interpreting small studies and with designing small studies, because it's just too easy to think you see something early on that maybe you don't see.
It was really devastating to have the phase 3 readout the way it did. I mean, something that we didn't expect. Seeing the phase 2 is amazing that it could be that different and not have any real signal. So that was an incredible disappointment. For me, it was initially this fairy tale story where we got involved very early on with these young entrepreneurs, help them build and grow and develop the company and take the drug through phase 2. And made a successful return, and then at the same time delivering a therapeutic that we thought extended life for patients. Maybe the start of a cocktail wasn't the answer, but it was maybe a start of, and that proved not to be true. And that was incredibly disappointing, personally, and something that did, as Melanie said, we spent a lot of time reflecting on what went wrong and what can we learn from it. How can we be better investors? How can we be better supporters of companies, and ultimately, choose which companies are more likely to be successful, so that we can help accelerate the winners. And so I think we've taken a lot of that on board ourselves, and that's how we take that lens and apply that to every new investment. How do we understand the biomarker and target engagement, and how can we be more certain of the company's likely success? The good news is the Amylyx is that story is yet to be fully written. They've bounced back. They've got some late stage therapeutics, not ALS related, but late stage therapeutics that are in the pipeline, and hopefully they'll be successful there. And then that money will get funneled back into their early stage pipeline of ALS therapeutics. So that's one that's not fully written yet. We're still really excited and big believers in Josh and Justin.
I saw their stock was up big today. I don't know if this will be the part that's cut out of the episode, because I don't know if you guys can comment, but why was their stock? Do you see their stock jump so much today? It jumped like 10% or something.
Actually, I don't know.
I wasn't sure if there's something.
I'm guessing. Happened. Well, yeah, I'll go look. I didn't look today, but I'm guessing it was probably something around their lead. So they bought a phase 3 asset, so a pretty late stage, pretty de-risked drug for a completely different indication. And so it might be that they had a milestone along that. I think that's right now where the market's valuing the company is based on their lead, not so much on their early stage stuff. We like their early stage ALS stuff, but the rest of the market's focusing on their late stage stuff.
Got it.
But I'll look. I'll let you know. I'll take a look and see if I can figure it out. Yeah. sometimes it's so random. I'm like, why, what, like who saw something and made a connection that doesn't make any sense to me? So,
Are there any companies in your portfolio right now that you think could be game changers?
yeah, I think hopefully there's a couple. I mean, that's sort of our model is we're hoping when we go into a company, we're hoping each one has the potential to really be a game changer. Right now, I think, we're really, really excited about Curalis, which this is also embarrassing. It took me a long time to realize that Curalis is Cure ALS. So they position themselves as a cure, and I would, because it's a Q, and I didn't. Anyway, they've been very, very, I think, effective in advancing a number of ALS programs based on a really relatively new observation of sort of things downstream of TDP-43, which I know Merritt talked about on the podcast previously, which is the key sort of fundamental pathology of the vast majority of ALS. And so Curalis has focused on genetic targets that seem to be responding to TDP-43. And so we're really excited about, they have a number of programs that look potentially promising that they could have significant impact on the disease, targeting different things. So targeting, one of their programs targets the axon, so the communication pipeline from one either neuron to another neuron or neuron to muscle. So it's focusing on that communication. Another of their drug program is focusing on the synapse. So that's again neuron to neuron communication up, in the brain. And then they have another program which is targeting hyperexcitability. So this tendency of neurons in ALS to be firing too much, have the circuit be overactive, and driving it too hard. So all of those we think are really have a lot of promise. So I think that's definitely, we're hoping and think they have the potential to be a game changer. I guess the other company I'll just mention, and Craig, you might have some other thoughts on, is Vectory, which is a company in Europe, and they're actually directly targeting TDP-43. So I think Merritt also might have mentioned at least one of those when she was talking here. But so Vectory, because they're trying to target what we think is a key driver across all of that heterogeneous ALS, that could really be a game changer.
Yeah, using a viral vector to get the antibody across the blood-brain barrier could be applicable to broader neurodegenerative diseases as well beyond ALS. So it's those are two quite exciting platforms. I'd say there's two others that I might mention: Verge Genomics, and that's we talked about AI earlier, and they're looking to use AI, machine learning, big data to identify therapeutic targets and then design drugs to go after those targets. They've had a couple of pharma partnerships and collaborations, and they're also now in the clinic with a PIC5 therapeutic. And what's interesting about PIC5 is there's a couple of other players that are also going after that target. And so hopefully there's some validation through that, but independently through their data model. So that one is really interesting to keep an eye on. And then Bloom Science is another one that that's a little bit of a different approach, and it's the microbiome approach, which is getting a lot of interest. I think that gut-brain axis is really something there. Increasingly, I think people are seeing it and believing it. They studied the ketogenic diet and identified akkermansia as elevated, as reducing epileptic seizures, and in combination with other microbes, potentially neuroprotective for ALS. And so we're really interested in that approach. And then I would say we're getting close to our 10th investment, a company called Progenics, which is going after a MAT4 kinase approach. So again, hopefully all these are complementary in different ways. And then our pipeline of another half a dozen or more companies we see could be really interesting, including one that looks like they may be able to, from a blood sample, identify ALS Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, and that, if that's true, that could be pretty interesting.
Is it early detection, or is it after you
Could be
get
early
noticed?
detection. Yeah, it was pretty. I mean, we need to get into diligence. We're still early. The company is still early, so we won't mention it. But it does seem like if they've got something to these toxic bodies that are flowing through the blood, that it could be a real game changer in therapeutic approach as well as diagnosis. I think having that early diagnosis is key. Earlier treatment is always going to be better, and if we're able to pick it up before the disease starts to show its cumulative clinical effect or detriment, that would be really novel and a huge benefit for the likelihood of clinical success.
Yeah, getting back to your point or question about regeneration, I think we're going to need to go early if we're going to have a strong ability to really perturb or revert the system back.
Drug development takes forever, and the regulatory process is slow. What needs to change so we can get ALS treatments to patients faster?
That's a hard question. So where to even start sort of to unpack all that? So I think that, and Mary talked about this as well. I think the platform definitely can help us accelerate drug development, because it's not just the regulatory part, which is slow, but also, recruiting takes a long time. Getting your CRO in place, getting all of the documents signed and sent out and signed off on. There's just a lot of operational complexity to running a clinical trial. And that's all the way at the end of drug development, right? So forget all the science part that, the failed experiments and the reagents that, you ordered them and they didn't come to your lab, they went next door, and, like all of the stuff that happens. So even once you get into the clinic, there's still a lot of complexity and a lot of things that can take a lot of time. So the Healy platform enables a lot of that to just stay, it exists, right? So it's sort of there in perpetuity. So you're not having to rebuild that over and over. And that, I think, has saved already a lot of time and is an amazing efficiency. On the regulatory path, I think the regulator's role is to try and protect people. And, they take their job really seriously. And, for many, many reasons, the people I think who work in FDA, and when I worked in government, I worked with a lot of them. The agency is typically under-resourced. There's not enough people there. There's not enough, people, there's turnover. So they're being asked to do an incredibly large, important, complicated job without the resources to really fully do that job. So I do think that's part of it. And then there's not always alignment in terms of, how the regulators are viewing their role and how the rest of the ecosystem is viewing their role. But I do think that that's been getting better. I think there's been a lot more communication between clinicians, between key opinion leaders, regulators, people with lived experience, the other parts of academia, the other parts of government, as well as academia. So I think I'm hopeful that that's been getting smoother. I think Amylyx actually helped smooth some of that path as well for folks who are coming behind it. But, so when I worked at Biogen, I got to see how the sausage was made, right? And I thought to myself, this is as complicated as building a rocket ship. So designing a clinical trial in some ways is as complicated as building a rocket ship. It's really complicated. And so it's inherently slow because there are so many factors to consider, because there are so many places where things can go wrong. And so So in terms of how can we make that better, Merritt mentioned this, and I agree with her. There has been a huge increase in compliance, and sort of legal aspects of what needs to happen. And that's where the regulatory complexity issue, I think, that people get frustrated with. So that's certainly an area, I think, where there could be some optimization. But then also, what we've been talking about the whole time in terms of having the right biomarkers, having readouts earlier in disease so that we can predict how someone will, if a drug can move something at an early stage of disease, and we know that that will eventually affect how the patient feels, functions, or survives, then that allows us to do a much shorter trial, for example, or a smaller trial. And that will make things go faster. And then what I was saying before also about if we had more predictive models where we knew if something works in this model, that means it's going to work, then that also will allow things to go much faster. So I appreciate the frustration. I worked at Faster Cures. The whole point of Faster Cures was to get cures, but like, how do we make the whole process move more quickly?
If you had a magic wand and you could just solve one thing with this process, what would it be?
To make it go the fastest, like what would be the fastest thing?
If you could eliminate one of the many
steps,
barriers.
Yeah. So I think the thing that would probably be the fastest would be a better model. The thing that would probably be the most cost effective would be to have an NFL-like biomarker, a biomarker that predicted at an early time frame, in a short period of time, what would happen down the road, so that you could make decisions, clinical decisions or regulatory decisions at an earlier point. So one would make it go faster, one would make it cheaper.
Yeah, it seems like the combination of the platform trial, better biomarkers, and now I think we have made progress with the regulatory bodies, you said, Melanie, and them having flexibility to approve something that is safe after a phase 2 trial and then doing a post-market phase 3. At least we're getting drug to patients, even if it doesn't work, as long as it's safe. Andrew Lowe wrote a whole paper and study using Emilix as a case study of why the FDA shouldn't just have stagnant, benchmarks or hurdles for every indication, because ones that have high unmet need, that are rapidly progressing, patients have a much different tolerance for what is safety and what does efficacy mean. And so hopefully we've made some progress, and hopefully in all three, and we continue to need to push on those dimensions, because that will ultimately lead to faster drug discovery, or at the very least faster failure. It's a faster failure than you're learning, and that ultimately leads to faster discovery.
I do wish that, so, the regulators who look at cancer drugs seem like they are much more tolerant of risk, or tolerant of, I think that the neuro part of FDA, that the part that reviews the ALS drugs, they're lumping ALS in with things like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's, which are slow and take a long time to progress. And so they're not thinking about ALS like an aggressive cancer. And so they're not using the same decision-making matrix, I want to say, when they look at drugs as folks do when they're looking at aggressive cancers. And so trying to have ALS considered more like an aggressive cancer and less like a more slowly moving neurodegenerative disease, I think would also help.
Gene therapy and RNA-based treatments are generating buzz in the neurodegenerative disease world. Are these real solutions for ALS, or are we still in the early days?
I think both, actually. I think we're still in early days for some of the really, really exciting genetic approaches that have been developed. But, we already have an ASO therapy approved. We have another one which is looking really promising. And we have a whole bunch of gene therapies, which are actually in clinical trials right now. So I think we will see new genetic therapies and new approaches to genetic therapy coming down the pike. But I do think we're already at a place where some of them are going to be very impactful. I was just at an ALS conference earlier this week, and there was a presentation on CRISPR-based therapy, where CRISPR is kind of a buzzword, but we're sort of going in and trying to cut out the mutation or put something in to handle the mutation, and they're making some really nice progress with a complicated but really exciting set of tools. So it's coming.
I mean, we invested in a gene therapy company called Apic Bio. It spun out of UMass Medical. It combined alpha-1 antitrypsin approach as well as Bob Brown's SOD1 gene therapy. Unfortunately, gene therapy kind of it's gone in waves. If you look at the history, it gets really excited, and then has some struggles, and funding leaves, and then it comes back and goes out. And so we invested in it. It looked really compelling. Science looked good, but then the funding dried up. The interest, people moved away. Thankfully, we were able to find a home for the SOD1 gene therapy at Unicure. And so that continues to make some progress through its phase 1 and carry on. So we're hopeful that will ultimately lead to a treatment for patients. But it was a challenge to very, very expensive to conduct the trials, to manufacture, and so you really need to have patient deep pockets to make that progress through the clinical trials.
Yeah, and I think the market also has just had trouble figuring out what to do with gene therapies because the price tag is so high. So we have seen companies with gene therapies that are approved that then they take them off the market because they're too expensive and too few patients need them. So we probably need changes on that end as well.
Do you think more transparency and open data sharing would speed up ALS research?
So there is a lot of transparency and data sharing that's happening, and has been increasing over the past 10 years. There's large international efforts like Project Mine. There's Answer ALS is sharing. I think there's been a lot of data sharing. I do think there's some perverse incentives or disincentives in academia to be protective around data. Academia is really hard to be successful at, and so I do think the foundations can play a role and have been playing a role in trying to increase that. But I think overall in ALS, there's a fair bit of sharing compared to other disease indications. And I think we're just seeing more and more of that.
It seems like that's one of the big pushes with Target ALS and bringing together collaboration, and then they're having open resources for researchers and pharma companies to access. And so obviously given their size and their importance in the coming years, that'll be hopefully an increasingly valuable resource on top of Answer ALS and a number of the other biobanks and blood banks.
Yeah, and the AMP ALS effort, which is a public-private partnership, I think is going to be, will be open access data. And I think there's more collaboration now between European and US data sets and data acquisition. And so, yeah, I do think it will be helpful, but I do think that the community is really focused on that and has been making really good progress. And it's funny because if you ask an AI person, when we say big data in biology, they kind of laugh at us and they're like, that's not big data. Big data is, taking everybody's phone records for the whole country. That's big data. What you guys are talking about is not big data. But I do think we're getting to the point where we have large enough data sets for really good data mining and letting some of those tools loose on data.
If you could change one thing about how ALS research is funded and conducted, what would it be?
I think that a lot of folks are frustrated at how long it takes to apply for grants, to get those grants approved, to get the actual money to the grantee. I mean, that is also very slow, and it's it's frustrating, I think, for folks. Although that's a hard question to ask now. So yeah, I think just having everything move faster, having less paperwork for the folks applying for the funding, having the funding be able to get to the grantee faster, I think would be probably the thing that most people would want. And I think the foundations have actually been trying to be thoughtful about that and making, I work with a lot of foundations in the ALS space. There's been a lot of effort to, make the grant applications shorter, make them, more concise, so then they can be reviewed more quickly, so that decisions can be made more quickly, so that funds can go out more quickly. So I do think on the foundation side, there's been a lot of focus on trying to deal with that. It's just a lot harder on the government side because there's so many constraints that the funding agencies are operating under.
I'd say one of my frustrations of observations of frustrations or challenges is just how fragmented the ALS foundations and groups are, and so and they don't necessarily seem to collaborate. I think increasingly there you see some, but there's so many different little pockets of money that are spreading around, and there's some good at that. You're getting a lot of local funding for different researchers, but if there was, and I think you can go to too far an extreme where you have one large body that's controlling all the grant making, and is not necessarily the right model either. But if there's some better way to bring cohesion and bring scale of dollars, so that the researchers can just apply to one or two rather than a whole bunch of different grants, I think that would be interesting. And so my overarching perspective on the nonprofit is just how do we create more nonprofit collaboration. I think organizations like Target ALS are encouraging pharma and academia collaboration. I think trying to find ways, and I know Tim and Troy, you guys are doing that, heavily involved with Steve Gleaston and others. And so I would just sort of encourage more of that, more collaboration within the nonprofit and pools of capital.
Yeah, so there's actually a couple of new initiatives in this space. There's a global research roundtable, which is a bunch of different foundations all coming together to talk about exactly this issue. Like, is there a way to have like a common app for college, but to have a common app for grants or something like that? Or a way to, use the same system so you don't have to enter in the same information in 5 different ways, depending on which foundation you're applying to, or things like that. So I do think there's, and this is at a global level, not even just at the national level, I do think there's some efforts happening now to make that more efficient. Not, like you were saying, Craig, just so that you don't have to apply over and over again in all these different ways to all these little pockets, and spend so much time doing that.
It seems like that's one thing we've said since the very beginning is it's so many small like tribes rather than kind of bigger. And obviously, Target, there's some really big ones out there like Dan Doctoroff, and there are some really big ones, but there's so many smaller ones, and there's so many influential smaller ones that we've been saying since the beginning, like, how do we get everyone on the same boat? But I think the issue is going back to, Melanie, like you were saying earlier, is everyone's is so different. And I think even the views on a solution are so different. Whereas like Team Gleason, who we're close with, they look at technology and we are thinking, technology is great, but we're thinking more of a science-based approach. And I'm sure there's people out there who are thinking, forget the technology and forget that, go to the brain chip interface, right? So it's like everyone's kind of pushing different ways, which that's part of the problem, but
Yeah.
Or the good
Well,
and the bad. I mean, I think it's similar with scientists, right? There's gene therapy, there's small molecule, there's stem cell. There's these different approaches, and I think we probably, until we have a clarity, we probably need all of them, and so I think the same is true on these different different initiatives. But yeah, some ways of bringing scale, and that's always what we've envisioned the ALS Investment Fund doing, trying to bring scale to the clinical trial development, so you can have fragmentation of the scientists and of the foundations, because there's lots of good basic science that's going into it. Though it could be more effective if it were or had some more scale. But ultimately, once you get therapeutics out of the lab and into the clinic, then you definitely need scale. And so if we can try to be a platform to bring together investing in the most promising ALS therapeutics, we can help them get through the clinic more efficiently.
and I think you can focus on process that still allows everyone to have their own focus area, but the processes are more standardized, or less bureaucratic or less complex, so that it's you're not trying to change and tell Team Gleason you need to focus on something else, but you can say, but if your grant portal looks very similar to somebody else's grant portal, something like that, then that could also just be an efficiency on an operations level, even if not on the content.
They cut me off whenever, but it seems like you should be able to do a grant. Everyone applies the same way. That seems like some of the stuff we've said today. It seems like, oh, how the heck would you do that? But some of it, like that seems
Pretty
I
straightforward.
don't want to say the word easy,
Doable.
anything to do with
Doable.
ALS. Yeah, it seems very doable. It seems like low-hanging fruit compared
Yeah.
to some of the other stuff.
Yeah, agree. And so I think this global effort to think about that is exciting. Now it's there's no stick you can use with any given entity. Maybe there's some carrots, or maybe it's just a compelling enough case that people will see that it benefits their goals in the end. But I think the fact that people are talking about it now and thinking about how we implement it is promising.
Craig, you've spent your career in private equity where success is measured in deals and returns. How has working in ALS changed your perspective on what really matters?
It's a great question. Certainly impact and mission was a big driver. And it's been a great second career for me, bringing together this ALS mission and trying to leverage my career investing experience. I joke that I was a failed scientist. I wasn't able to bring the science to bear. Thankfully, I've partnered with Melanie, but hopefully I can bring my investing experience to bear on ALS. The great thing is, we can have clarity of mission. I mean, it's very clear we want to drive accelerated therapeutic development for ALS. And if we're successful in that, then we're going to be successful in making an attractive financial return. And so returns are definitely aligned with mission, but mission is a guiding principle. And we think about that from a multitude of angles. In addition to thinking about downside and traditional investing portfolio construction, so we can ultimately minimize downside, get returns to our investors, even if we're not initially successful with finding an ALS therapeutic, but that will encourage investors to continue to invest with us until we ultimately do. And so that's the main goal. It's been really rewarding and to carry this into action and partner with Felix and Melanie. And I think that's the inspiration from my father and then all the different ALS patients that I've come in contact with. Just an amazing group. Some of them you've had on the podcast, Aaron Lazar and John Driscoll-Hopkins, and I think soon to be Dan Doctoroff. Just amazing folks. Others that have passed away. Pete Frady's, Boston native, and his family continues to carry on those efforts, and we're close with them. It was like his funeral was just unbelievable. The outpouring of the community and the impact that he made through that Ice Bucket Challenge inspiration, and so many more. Brian Wallach and IMALS, and you can go on down the list of my Mount Rushmore of ALS patients who are doing amazing things. And I'm just trying to do my role, and I think that's probably similar to what you and Troy are doing. It's just trying to use your platform and for good and for ALS, and that's what I'm looking to do as well.
Craig, you weren't a failed scientist. You were a scientist ahead of your time. It was just you just had to be another 20 years. The field caught up to you, and then
wasn't patient enough, I guess. That was. But hopefully, this is better use of my my time and talents.
That's actually funny. I think that's a common trait that all of us share in the ALS Investment Fund is none of us are super patient. I mean, and that's one of the reasons that I ended up leaving academia was because I wanted to be able to actually help people on a timeline that was, faster than I would have been able to in the lab 30 years ago. So.
Dr. Leitner, you've dedicated your life to studying and fighting this disease. How do you stay hopeful in a field where the stakes are so high and the progress can feel slow?
Yeah. I feel like I'm fighting. Like I literally use like fighting metaphors, like battle and war, and it really does feel like a fight. I mean, part of it is I see and I talk to patients, and their fight is so much even more personal and more immediate, and it's like I can't give up hope. I can't like go sit down and you feel like you're in it for other people. I've seen young kids and their parents are sick, and and they might have the mutation, and so I think part of it is thinking about the personal human cost for me, and feeling like I believe in what I'm doing, and I'm really trying hard to make a difference for all of those people. And then part of it is really just going back into the science and seeing, like I said, I was just at this meeting this week. The science was amazing. There were all of these new people coming to the field who weren't there 2 years ago or 5 years ago, and bringing their brilliance and their new techniques and their new perspectives. So it's really dynamic. And so I think that that is also very hopeful for me, to see that dynamism and to see, there have been times where, you go to a meeting and then a year later you come to the meeting and you're like, I have my notes from last year. This is almost exactly the same as what I heard last year. And those are the times that I think it's hard to feel excitement and enthusiasm. But over the past 5 years, that hasn't happened. It's getting faster and faster and more creative and more people and more, and more resources. And so I think we are on a upward trend in this disease. And then, seeing things like I think Merritt talked about this as well, with Neil Schneider and the FUS trial, where there was this 19-year-old girl who was treated young at a pretty early stage in her disease with a drug and was able to go up the stairs fluidly once she was on this treatment. So seeing progress like that, or an SMA with the little kids that they're able to, they keep them alive now. So I just feel like there's a lot of very positive, hopeful signs. And so I try and remind myself of those and keep those top of mind, even when we have a lot of failures.
ALS is relentless, and we need people like you pushing things forward, not just in the lab, but on the business side too. The work you're doing with the ALS Investment Fund isn't just about backing biotech companies. It's about changing the way we approach this disease, cutting through the red tape and making progress. Craig, Melanie, thank you for what you're doing, and thanks for coming on today. I appreciate your time in the conversation. Now go find the cure, and let's do a follow-up episode. God bless.
I love it. Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be on and to talk to you, and hard questions, but great questions.
Yeah, no, likewise. It's been a real honor and privilege to spend the time, and through this experience for me, it's been therapeutic and enlightening. I tell everybody now that I try to live like I have ALS, and what I mean by that is have an urgency. The Alexander Hamilton and running like you're running out of time, and so have that urgency to find a cure. But at the same time, also appreciate the little things, the family, friends, faith, and just hearing and talking to all these different patients with ALS. They oftentimes say that they're the happiest they've ever been, which seems like such a conflict. How can that possibly be true? But I think it's because they have found purpose and found appreciation for the little things, the faith, family, and friends, and so that's my new MO for how I try to conduct my life, and it's quite uplifting, I would say, and so this is a career that has really brought a whole new energy and new enlightenment.
My dad has said before, so I'm stealing the words from his mouth. They said how basically every day is like truly a gift, and when he approached life like that, yeah, it's hard to beat that.
Yeah, for sure.
I saw you asked a lot of people about, what's a book that they would recommend. And so one of the books that I've just found really along those same lines is it's 4,000 Weeks, Time Management for Mortals, which is saying exactly that. Like each day, that's what it is. That's what you have. That's all you have. That's your life. Yeah.
I'm writing that one down.
Now on to our final word segment, where we ask our guests a few rapid fire questions. What was the happiest moment in your life?
Yeah, it would have to be when the arrival of my daughter and son. Equally amazing to have them in my life.
Can't answer that. I can't, when they both arrived, I was so out of it and not. Yeah, I can't answer that question.
What is the biggest adversity you've faced?
Yeah, so for me, it was my father getting diagnosed with ALS. That's a pretty tough blow when you're 22. I think about it a lot now. I'm almost 53, and my father didn't see his 54th birthday. So it's been something that has been a real challenge, but also a privilege to try to turn something that challenging, that devastating into a positive impact.
I have nothing on that same level. I think just for me, deciding to leave a toxic job rather than stay in a toxic job.
What are you most excited about?
So I'm most excited about ALS breakthroughs and that are on the horizon, and investing in those, supporting amazing scientists and entrepreneurs in their development and pushing them through the clinical trials to approval, and seeing that some of our investments pay off in real impact to patients in terms of a therapeutic and ultimately to our investors as well. But yeah, that would be an amazing, and that's my the remaining of my life goal is to be part of that.
So my CEO at Prize for Life, so Avi, said his goal for Prize for Life was to throw his wheelchair off the edge of a cliff because we had cured ALS. And I have always thought that was a great image.
What advice would you give your younger self?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I would say be a little bit easier on yourself, and ultimately, recognize the importance of relationships and appreciate the little things. Many of the things that I'm trying to do now, with as I have perspective on life. But those are probably the big things. Go a little bit easier on yourself and focus on building great, lasting relationships of substance, and appreciate those little things: faith, family, and friends.
Yeah, I guess I would tell myself, there's no single path to being happy or successful. And so if you make mistakes, that's okay.
That's good. Melanie, here's yours. Do you guys have any book recommendations for us or for the listeners?
Yeah, so the one that I read, Season of Life by Jeffrey Marks, football story. So you guys will both enjoy it. But it was a summer reading for my son who was entering his freshman year at St. Sebastian's High School, and it's a great book. It talks about the myths or the false pretense of manhood. So it's not about strength, power, money. It's really about being a man of purpose and a man for others. And so I thought it was a great message, and it's all wrapped in a football story, a really impressive coach who creates a great culture and something for all teens and high school students to read. Really inspiring.
That's nice. Yeah, so I mentioned the 4,000 weeks and the time management for mortals, but I'll also just say for anyone who is, interested in neuroscience and why neuroscience is amazing, that one of the books that was sort of catalytic for me in terms of committing to pursuing neuroscience all along was a book called Molecules of the Mind, which was just talking about sort of how the brain uses molecules to do all the things your brain does, right? And so how we've discovered what some of those are and the scientists behind some of that work. So that was and then can I say a fiction book? Because these
Absolutely.
are all nonfiction. Oh, okay. So a fiction book that I really just really enjoyed is called The Goldbug Variations. It's by Richard Powers, and it's a fictional story about it's both like a love story, but also a story about people trying to figure out DNA and how is DNA actually leading to the formation of something as complex as us. Like, what is that? So there's a really, really interesting combination of topics that I really enjoyed.
The name of our podcast is Nothing Left Unsaid. Do you have anything you want to say?
Just thank you. Thanks for the time. It's been real pleasure to spend it with you, and hopefully we get to meet face to face. Maybe when I'm out dropping off my daughter at Cornell, I can stop by and grab a coffee and hang for a bit. But I know you guys are up in the Syracuse area, right? So that'd be awesome.
Yeah, just thank you, and it's amazing everything that you've done, Tim. And I don't know how you've done it all, but it's really inspiring. If I ever write even a chapter as opposed to writing all of those books, that would be amazing. So yeah, just thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to talk with you. It was really fun.
Before we let you guys go, at the end of every episode, I ask the guests, who's a guest that you think we should have on? It doesn't have to be ALS related. It can be. Who's somebody you think we could have an interesting conversation with?
Yeah, we talked a lot about Amylyx, and I think Josh and Justin are just two amazing individuals, the co-CEOs of Amylyx, and they're in it, but just interesting stories and how they started this company basically right out of college. So real inspiration for any entrepreneurs out there, and getting through adversity. It was quite a roller coaster ride, even while we were invested, and it's continues to be that roller coaster ride. And I think it's going to end on a high, but yeah, it's a great one.
If either of them can't make it, or if only one can make it, you could also invite Rudy Tanzi, who was one of the first people who was sort of like a mentor to them, who's just hilarious. Like, my face hurts after I've been talking to him for 15 minutes. He has so many stories, and, from being in band and knowing everybody in the music industry to, all of the research he's been doing at Harvard and all the people he's met. I mean, he's a lot of fun.
We'll have to reach out to him, because Merritt said to me offline, she said, "Oh, you got to try and get Rudy."
Yeah, he's just, yeah. And he's also written a lot of really interesting books with Deepak Chopra about, so I think also he could talk about that, like so many things.
Plays with Aerosmith, and he's a hoot.
He's a lot of fun. Yep.
Well, thanks so much for both of you to take some time out of your day to talk with us. We appreciate it, and also appreciate all the work you're doing in the ALS.
Thanks to both of you again, not only for supporting the podcast and joining us today, but for the bigger mission of fighting ALS. We are all in this together.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Today's episode is brought to you by the ALS Investment Fund, a specialized biotech venture capital investment firm focused on neurodegenerative diseases, particularly ALS. They manage a large and diversified worldwide portfolio of ALS-related companies, collaborating with a global network of scientists, clinicians, foundations, and patient advocates to accelerate therapeutic development, investing for a world without ALS. Discover more about their mission and impact at alsinvestmentfund.com. If you enjoyed today's episode, consider supporting the podcast for free by subscribing on your favorite podcast platform, leaving a review, and sharing it with your friends. Your support means the world to us. This episode of Nothing Left Unsaid is brought to you by 11 Labs. Their groundbreaking technology makes a huge difference, and we're grateful for their support. To learn more, visit 11labs.io. A substantial portion of our sponsorship proceeds go to tackleals.com, funding cutting-edge ALS research. If you'd like to join the fight and contribute, visit tackleals.com. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time on Nothing Left Unsaid.